My name is Amelia Vance, though for the first 2 decades of my career, I was little more than a ghost haunting the brilliant machine of my father's legacy. At 42, I stood in the shadow of the man who had, by every public measure, defined modern architecture in the American West. I was the secret engine of his genius, the silent author of his most celebrated creations. My hands drew the lines that won the awards. His voice accepted the applause. I sacrificed my name, my youth, and my own artistic identity to the grand, gilded altar of our family firm, Vance & Associates. I did this because I believed I was not just building structures of steel and glass. I was building a cathedral to my mother's memory, a legacy that would one day be mine. I never imagined that the foundation of that legacy was rotten to the core. I never imagined that the man I had given my entire life to would, in a single, calculated act of self-preservation, turn my life's work into my public disgrace. This is the story of how the collapse of a building precipitated the collapse of my entire world. It's a story about the deafening silence of betrayal, and the quiet, patient work of rebuilding a life, not from a blueprint of ambition, but from a foundation of truth. The city of Denver is a city of sharp lines and brilliant, unforgiving light. The jagged peaks of the Rockies to the west are a constant, humbling presence, a natural architecture against which all man-made structures are judged. For most of my life, the most celebrated of those structures, the ones that defined the city's modern skyline, were born in the quiet of my office, late at night, under the soft glow of a drafting lamp. My father, Marcus Vance, was not a creator. He was a curator. He was a man of immense charm and staggering ambition, with a salesman's smile and a poet's gift for narrative. He could sell a vision. He could stand before a city council, or a boardroom of investors, and paint a picture with his words, describing buildings of impossible grace and light, structures that didn't just occupy space but elevated the human spirit. The only problem was that he couldn't draw a straight line with a ruler. The visions he sold were mine. The dynamic was established so early in my life that it felt as natural as breathing. My mother, Eleanor Vance, had been the real architect, the true prodigy. Her early work was lyrical, innovative, and deeply connected to the landscape. She was the soul of the firm. My father was its face. When I was 10, she was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive form of cancer. She was gone in less than a year, leaving behind a void that was both emotional and professional. My father was adrift, the charismatic frontman of a band whose songwriter had just died. I was a quiet, serious child who had inherited my mother's gift. I spent my childhood in her studio, surrounded by the smell of graphite and trace paper. I understood the language of blueprints before I understood algebra. After her death, my father, in a stroke of manipulative genius, reframed my talent not as my own, but as a continuation of hers. He made me the secret vessel of her legacy. "Your mother's work can't die with her, Amy," he would tell me, his voice thick with a carefully rehearsed grief, as he looked over a sketch I had made. "We have to keep her vision alive. Through you. Through me. It's our sacred duty to her memory." And I, a grieving child desperate to hold on to some piece of my mother, believed him. I became his secret apprentice, his ghost. By the time I graduated from Cornell, with a master's in architecture, I was already the de facto chief designer at Vance & Associates. My name was never on the letterhead. My face was never in the magazines. But my DNA was in every line, every curve, every pane of glass of every building we created. The system was a well-oiled machine. I would work for months, sometimes years, on a design, pouring my entire being into the project. I would solve the complex engineering puzzles, refine the aesthetic, and oversee the creation of the technical drawings. Then, just before the public unveiling, my father would sweep in. He would study my work, absorb my design philosophy, and memorize the key phrases I had used to describe the project's intent. Then he would step in front of the cameras and present my work as his own, with a flawless, passionate performance that left no doubt as to the identity of the creative genius. I told myself it didn't matter. The work, the art, was the thing. The legacy was what counted. I was playing the long game. One day, my father would retire, and the firm, the legacy I had so painstakingly built in his name, would finally be mine. It was a promise, unspoken but ever-present, the foundational myth of my entire adult life. The pinnacle of this arrangement, and the beginning of its end, was the Solstice Tower. It was a 50-story skyscraper in the heart of downtown, a spiraling structure of glass and white steel, designed to catch the light in a unique way at every hour of the day. It was my masterpiece, the culmination of 5 years of relentless, obsessive work. I had solved structural challenges that had baffled our engineering team, designing a unique internal buttressing system that allowed the tower its impossible, slender grace. It was more than a building. It was a piece of my soul, rendered in concrete and steel. The night of its grand opening gala, I stood in the back of the crowded lobby, a ghost in a simple black dress, while my father stood at a podium bathed in the warm glow of spotlights. He was in his element, charming and eloquent, his silver hair catching the light. "Architecture," he began, his voice resonating through the soaring three-story atrium I had designed, is not merely about shelter. It is about aspiration. It is about creating a dialogue between the earth and the sky, between human ambition and the eternal light. I felt a familiar, dull ache in my chest. Those were my words, lifted directly from the design brief I had written for him. He continued, describing the way the tower's helical shape was designed to mirror the growth patterns of a sunflower, a concept born from a sketch in one of my mother's old notebooks. He was curating my work, my mother's inspiration, and weaving it all into the grand narrative of his own singular genius. The applause, when it came, was thunderous. The mayor, the governor, the city's cultural and financial elite, they were all on their feet. I watched as people surged forward to shake his hand, to congratulate him on his vision. I remained in the shadows, an anonymous face in the crowd. Later that evening, an elderly man with kind, knowing eyes approached me. It was Elias Thorne, the head of our firm's model-making department. He was a craftsman of the old school, a man who had worked with my mother in the firm's early days. He was one of the few people who knew the truth of our arrangement. "It's a magnificent building, Amelia," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. He didn't look at the crowd or the soaring architecture. He looked at me. "It's your best work yet. It's Eleanor, all over again." "Thank you, Elias," I whispered, my throat tight. "He's good with words," Elias said, nodding towards my father, who was now holding court with a group of journalists. "But words don't hold up a 50-story building. Your lines do." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Be careful, Amy. A man who gets too comfortable living in a house he didn't build might forget what a real foundation feels like." I dismissed his warning as the gentle concern of an old friend. I was too invested in the dream, too deep in the myth of our shared legacy. I had sacrificed too much to question it now. My life outside the firm was a barren landscape. Friendships had withered from years of canceled plans and missed birthdays. Romantic relationships had failed to take root in the sterile soil of my work-obsessed existence. The firm was all I had. The promise of it, the eventual inheritance of this architectural kingdom, was the central pillar of my identity. It was a few weeks after the Solstice Tower opening that the project that would bring it all crashing down came to us. It was a commission to design the new Northwood Public Library, a major civic project for a working-class neighborhood on the north side of the city. For most firms, a public library would be a mid-level respectable project, but I saw it as something more. It was a chance to create a real community hub, a space of light, learning, and sanctuary. It was the kind of project my mother would have loved. I threw myself into the design. I spent weeks in the Northwood neighborhood, talking to residents, to librarians, to children. I didn't want to impose a monument on them. I wanted to build them a home for their minds. The design I created was, I believe, the most thoughtful and humane work of my career. It was a low-slung building of warm brick, reclaimed wood, and vast expanses of glass, designed around a central, sunlit courtyard. It was welcoming, accessible, and beautiful in its simplicity. The potential for awards was low. The budget was tight. The location was unfashionable. My father was, at first, completely uninterested, dismissing it as a charity project, but I fought for it. I convinced him that a beloved, community-focused project would be good for the firm's public image, a humble counterpoint to the corporate grandeur of the Solstice Tower. He finally, reluctantly, agreed. "Fine," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's your pet project. Just make sure it comes in on budget. The margins on this are razor thin." It was during the construction phase that the first, deep cracks in our foundation began to appear. I had specified a certain grade of structural steel for the long-span beams that would support the library's wide, open-plan roof. It was a critical structural element. A few months into the build, I received a change order request from the contractor, approved by my father. He had authorized a switch to a cheaper, lower-grade steel from a different supplier. I stormed into his office, the change order clutched in my hand. "What is this?" I demanded. "We can't substitute this steel. It compromises the load-bearing capacity. It's not safe." He leaned back in his leather chair, his expression one of paternalistic weariness. "Amelia, it's called value engineering." I ran the numbers with the contractor. "The new steel is perfectly adequate, and it saves the project nearly $500,000. The client, the city, will be thrilled. Adequate isn't the standard we build to," I argued, my voice rising. "Our name is on this building. My mother's name is on this firm. We don't cut corners on safety." "Don't be so naive and emotional," he said, his voice taking on a hard edge. "This is a business. Sometimes, difficult decisions have to be made to protect the bottom line. I have made the decision. It's done. Now are you going to be a team player, or are you going to be a hysterical amateur?" The words were a calculated blow, and they landed perfectly. He had questioned my professionalism, my loyalty, my composure. I deflated, the righteous anger draining out of me, replaced by a familiar, weary sense of defeat. I had been put back in my place. I was the ghost, the silent partner, He was the one who made the final decisions. I retreated, telling myself he was right, that he had more experience in the business side of things. I told myself that the engineers must have signed off on it, that it must be safe. It was a lie I chose to believe, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. Elias saw the revised structural drawings a week later. He came to my office, his face grim. "This is wrong, Amy," he said, his finger tracing the line of the main roof beam. "This steel is too thin for a span this wide, especially with the snow loads we get here. Marcus is playing with fire." "He said it was fine, Elias," I said, my voice weaker than I wanted it to be. "The engineers approved it." "The engineers work for him," Elias replied, his eyes full of a sad, knowing pity. "They'll approve whatever he tells them to. Your mother, Eleanor, would never have signed off on this. She would have burned the whole project to the ground before she let them put that steel in the air." His words haunted me for weeks, but I pushed them down. I buried myself in the final design details of the library's interior, focusing on the things I could still control: the color of the tiles, the design of the bookshelves, the placement of the reading nooks. I told myself I was still honoring my mother's legacy by making the space beautiful, even if the bones of the building were not what they should have been. I was complicit in the lie, and my silence was the price of the fragile piece in our gilded cage. The Northwood Public Library opened on a bright, crisp Saturday in early autumn. The ceremony was a cheerful, low-key affair, a world away from the champagne-soaked glamour of the Solstice Tower Gala. There were local politicians, a children's choir that sang slightly off-key, and hundreds of families from the neighborhood, their faces filled with a genuine, unpretentious excitement. My father gave a speech, of course. He spoke beautifully about the power of books and the importance of community. He accepted a plaque from the mayor, his smile radiating a benevolent, paternalistic pride. I stood in the crowd, next to Elias, feeling a complicated mixture of pride and a deep, gnawing unease. The building was beautiful. The light streamed through the large windows, just as I had designed it to. Children were already exploring the colorful, welcoming spaces. It was a living, breathing testament to the good that architecture could do. But every time I looked up at the wide, sweeping expanse of the roof, I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. For the next year and a half, the library was a resounding success. It became the true heart of the Northwood community. Its after-school programs were always full. Its computer terminals were in constant use. It was a safe, warm, and beautiful space, and I tried to let its success soothe my conscience. I told myself I had been wrong to worry. The engineers had been right. The building was sound. The winter of the following year was brutal. A series of massive, back-to-back snowstorms blanketed Denver in a thick, heavy layer of white. The city shut down for days at a time. Snowplows struggled to keep the main roads clear. It was the kind of epic, once-in-a-decade snow event that tests the limits of a city's infrastructure. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I was in my office, sketching out ideas for a new art museum project. It was my assistant, her voice a high, panicked squeak. "Amelia, turn on the news. Now." "Any channel." I clicked on the small television in the corner of my office. The screen was filled with a chaotic, horrifying image. A wide shot from a news helicopter, showing a familiar, low-slung brick building, its roofline grotesquely buckled in the middle. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Tragedy in Northwood. Roof of public library collapses under heavy snow." The blood drained from my face. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a vertiginous, spinning sensation, as if the floor had dropped out from under me. It was a nightmare I had been subconsciously dreading for 2 years. Elias's words echoed in my head. Asterisk, especially with the snow loads we get here. I don't remember leaving my office. I don't remember the drive. I just remember standing behind a police barricade a block away from the library, the air thick with the smell of wet plaster and something else, something metallic and sickening. The scene was one of organized chaos. Flashing lights of ambulances and fire trucks, the shouts of first responders, the grief-stricken wails of parents being kept back from the scene. The beautiful, welcoming space I had designed, my pet project, my tribute to my mother, had become a tomb, and I had helped to build it. The days that followed were a descent into a special kind of hell. The final toll was 4 dead, 2 preschool-aged children, and 2 mothers, and more than a dozen injured, some critically. The city was in mourning, and that mourning quickly turned to a raw, furious search for someone to blame. And the name on the plaque, the name on the original blueprints, was Vance and Associates. My father called an emergency meeting at the firm the day after the collapse. I expected to find a man shattered by guilt and grief. Instead, I found a man in full crisis management mode. He was surrounded by a team of our most ruthless corporate lawyers, his face a mask of grim, calculated resolve. "This is a catastrophe," he began, his voice low and steady. "An unthinkable tragedy. But we cannot let it destroy this firm. We cannot let it destroy your mother's legacy." He had already crafted the narrative. It was a tragic accident, an act of God, an unprecedented weather event. But as the city's investigators began to sift through the rubble, that narrative quickly fell apart. They recovered the failed steel beams. The preliminary analysis was damning. The steel was the wrong grade, dangerously insufficient for the structural load. This wasn't an act of God. It was an act of negligence. The focus shifted from the weather to the blueprints, to the material specifications, to the change orders. My name was everywhere. I was the lead designer. It was my vision. It was, as my father had so carelessly called it, my pet project. I knew what was coming. I knew that my father, a man who had built his entire life on the foundation of self-preservation, would not hesitate to sacrifice me to save himself. The final, formal betrayal came a week later, in the sterile conference room of our lawyer's office. It was just me, my father, and his lead attorney. My father looked at me, his eyes filled with a theatrical, well-rehearsed sorrow. "Amelia," he said, his voice thick with false emotion. "I don't know how this could have happened. I trusted you. I trusted your judgment on this project completely." He slid a file across the polished mahogany table. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a copy of the final, signed-off structural blueprints for the library. And there, at the bottom, was my digital signature, clear as day, on a set of drawings that specified the cheaper, substandard steel. They were forgeries, brilliant ones, created by digitally lifting my signature from another document and flawlessly integrating it. Next to them was a copy of the change order, also bearing my forged approval. "I don't understand," I whispered, the lie so audacious, so complete, that my mind couldn't fully grasp it. "I never signed this. I fought you on this." "The records show otherwise," the lawyer said, his voice flat and dispassionate. "Your signature is on the final approval. You were the architect of record for the structural specifications. The firm, and Mr. Vance, relied on your professional expertise." My father leaned forward, his face a mask of paternal grief. "This will destroy your mother's legacy, Amelia. The firm, her name, it will all be dragged through the mud." He was using her again, her memory, as the final, cruel twist of the knife. He was framing this as my failure to protect her. "You're framing me," I said, the words coming out in a choked whisper. The full, monstrous scope of his treachery was finally settling in. He wasn't just letting me take the fall. He had meticulously, methodically built the scaffold from which I would hang. "I am trying to save this firm," he corrected me, his voice suddenly cold, the mask of grief falling away to reveal the hard, ruthless man beneath. "The firm that has supported you your entire life. The firm that was supposed to be your future. You made a catastrophic, fatal error, and now there are consequences. I will do what I can to protect you, of course, but I have to protect the legacy. I have to protect your mother's name." He was offering me a deal. If I accepted the blame, if I played the part of the negligent, overwrought architect who had made a terrible mistake, he and his team of expensive lawyers would do what they could to mitigate the damage to me personally. But if I fought, if I accused him, it would be a messy public war, my word against his. And in the court of public opinion, who would they believe? The grieving, respected patriarch, or the disgraced, hysterical daughter he had so generously sheltered? I stood up, my chair scraping back against the floor. I looked at my father, the man I had spent my life trying to please, the man for whom I had sacrificed my own name and my own dreams. And I saw a stranger, a hollow man, a shell built of ambition and lies. "You are a monster," I said, my voice quiet but shaking with a rage so profound it felt like it could shatter my own bones. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes. "I am a survivor," he replied. "It's a lesson you clearly never learned." I walked out of that room, out of that building, and out of the life I had known. The legal storm that followed was a hurricane. I was named as the primary defendant in a dozen civil lawsuits filed by the victims' families. The State Architectural Board launched an investigation that resulted in the immediate and permanent revocation of my license. The district attorney's office began to make noise about criminal charges of involuntary manslaughter. My father, as promised, provided me with a lawyer from his firm. But I knew the man's real client was not me. It was Vance and Associates. His job was not to defend me, but to contain me, to ensure that my story never deviated from the official narrative. I was alone, truly alone, adrift in the wreckage of my own life, with the ghosts of dead children and the weight of a crime I did not commit hanging around my neck like a millstone. The year that followed the collapse was a free fall into a dark, soundless abyss. My name, Amelia Vance, became synonymous with tragedy and incompetence. I was a pariah in the city I had helped to build. News articles featured my photograph alongside images of the library's wreckage. Online comment sections were a cesspool of vitriol, strangers from around the world calling me a murderer, a monster, a disgrace to my profession. The lawsuits, as expected, were devastating. To avoid a protracted and public trial that would have inevitably drawn more attention to the firm, my father's lawyers advised me to settle. Under the terms of the settlement, Vance and Associates, as a corporate entity, paid a substantial sum to the victims' families. But the legal structure of the agreement placed the bulk of the personal liability squarely on me, the negligent architect of record. I was forced into bankruptcy. My assets, my savings, the beautiful downtown condo with its view of the mountains, all of it was liquidated to pay the claims. I went from a life of quiet affluence to being penniless in a matter of months. I lost more than just my money and my career. I lost my identity. For my entire life, I had been an architect. It was not just what I did, it was who I was. My mind naturally saw the world in terms of structure, light, and form. Now I couldn't even look at a building without feeling a wave of nausea and a crushing, suffocating guilt. The very thing that had once been my greatest source of joy was now the source of my deepest trauma. The city of Denver, a skyline I had helped to shape, became a museum of my own failure. Every corner I turned, I was confronted by a building that held a memory, a piece of my former life. After the bankruptcy was finalized, I was left with nothing but a few boxes of personal belongings and a profound, untethered sense of shame. I had to leave. I couldn't breathe in that city anymore. I sold my car for a few $1,000s, packed 2 suitcases, and bought a one-way bus ticket to Portland, Oregon, a city where no one knew my name, where the buildings held no ghosts. Life in Portland was a lesson in anonymity and humility. I rented a tiny, damp basement apartment in a part of the city that tourists never saw. I spent my days applying for jobs, any job. My resume, with its Ivy League education and 2 decades at a world-renowned architectural firm, was now a liability. It raised too many questions. A simple Google search of my name revealed the whole sordid story. I eventually found a job working the morning shift at a 24-hour diner, serving coffee and pancakes to truckers and early-rising construction workers. The irony was not lost on me. I, who had once designed multi-million-dollar structures, was now pouring coffee for the very men who built them. The work was mindless, exhausting, and paid just enough to cover my rent and cheap groceries. My hands, once skilled in the delicate art of drafting and model making, grew rough and calloused from carrying heavy plates and scrubbing countertops. My days were a gray, monotonous loop. Wake up at 4 a.m., work the shift. Come home, stare at the stained ceiling of my apartment, sleep. Repeat. The silence was the worst part. The silence was filled with the ghosts of the children who had died, with the memory of my father's cold eyes, with the crushing weight of my own complicity. I had known the steel was substandard. I had let my father bully me into silence, and 4 people had paid for my cowardice with their lives. The guilt was a physical presence, a heavy cloak I could never take off. The turning point came not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, creeping dawn. After nearly a year of this self-imposed exile, I received a letter. It had been forwarded from my old address, a wrinkled, much-traveled envelope. It was from Elias Thorne, my old friend from the model shop. His letter was short and simple. He told me he was sorry for what had happened, that he and a few others from the old firm had always known the truth. He told me he had retired and moved to Portland to be closer to his daughter. And he told me about a place where he was volunteering. It's called Foundations for Hope, he wrote, a non-profit that builds homes for homeless families. It's good, honest work, Amy. Real work. They're having a volunteer orientation day on Saturday. I thought you might be interested. My first instinct was to throw the letter away. The idea of being anywhere near a construction site felt like touching a hot stove. But Elias's words, real work, echoed in my mind. The work I was doing at the diner wasn't real. It was a penance, a way to pass the time until my life was over. Maybe, just maybe, there was another way. That Saturday I took a bus to a dusty, empty lot in a low-income neighborhood. A small group of people were gathered around a woman in her 50s who was holding a clipboard. This was Maria, the site supervisor and the heart and soul of Foundations for Hope. She was a tough, wiry woman with a sun-beaten face and hands that looked like they had been forged from iron. She explained the project. A small, simple, 3-bedroom house for a family of 5, the Garcias, who had been living in a shelter for over a year. I stood at the back of the group, feeling like an imposter. What was I, a disgraced architect, doing here? What could I possibly offer? But as Maria started assigning tasks, I found myself stepping forward. I can read blueprints, I said, my voice quiet, rusty from disuse. Maria looked at me, then at my soft, uncalloused hands, with a skeptical eye. But she handed me a set of the plans. All right, she said, you're with the framing crew. The first day was brutal. The work was physically demanding, and my body, softened by a year of inactivity and depression, protested every movement. But there was something profoundly grounding about the simple, repetitive labor. The weight of a hammer in my hand. The satisfying thud of a nail driving into wood. The smell of fresh-cut lumber. It was real. It was tangible. I wasn't creating an abstract vision. I was helping to build a wall, a single wall that would one day shelter a family. I kept coming back, every Saturday. I became a regular part of the small, dedicated crew of volunteers. They were a motley group, a retired postman, a college student, a young woman from a nearby church. They didn't ask about my past. They just accepted me as Amy, the quiet one, who's good with a tape measure. One afternoon, Maria found me sitting on a stack of plywood, staring at the blueprints, a thoughtful expression on my face. "Something wrong with the plans?" she asked. "No," I said. "I was just thinking. If we shifted this interior wall by about 18 inches and reoriented the windows on the south side, we could get direct sunlight into the main living space for most of the afternoon. It would save on heating costs in the winter and make the whole space feel larger." Maria stared at me, then back at the blueprints, a slow, dawning understanding on her face. "You're not just reading these plans, are you?" she said. "You're seeing through them. Who are you, Amy?" And so, for the first time in over a year, I told someone the truth. I told her my full name. I told her about Vance and Associates, about the library, about the collapse. I expected to see judgment in her eyes, or pity. Instead, I saw a flicker of something that looked like respect. "Damn," she said, letting out a low whistle. "They threw you to the wolves." She was silent for a moment. "Well, their loss is my gain. We've got a new project starting next month, a small community of 4 tiny homes for veterans. The plans we have are generic, soulless boxes. I have a budget of basically zero. Think you could make them better?" It was the first time anyone had asked me to design anything since the collapse. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. That night, for the first time in years, I didn't stare at the ceiling. I pulled out a cheap sketchbook and a pencil, and I began to draw. I wasn't designing a monument. I was solving a puzzle. How do you create a sense of dignity and beauty on a shoestring budget? How do you maximize space and light in less than 400 square feet? I poured all of my knowledge, all of my pent-up creativity, into those designs. I used passive solar principles, reclaimed materials, and clever, space-saving layouts. The designs were simple, elegant, and profoundly human. When I showed them to Maria, she just stared at them, her tough exterior cracking for a moment to reveal a deep, heartfelt emotion. "Amelia," she said, using my full name for the first time. "These aren't just houses. These are homes." The work on the veterans community became my salvation. I was on the site every day, not just as a designer, but as a builder. I worked alongside the future residents, the veterans themselves. They were men and women who were also rebuilding their lives, grappling with their own visible and invisible wounds. We didn't talk much about our pasts. We didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding among us. We were all just trying to build something solid and true out of the wreckage. One day, while we were raising the final wall of the first tiny home, one of the veterans, a young woman who had lost a leg in Afghanistan, turned to me. "You know, Amy," she said, "it feels good, doesn't it? To build something with your own hands. Something that's going to keep someone safe." "Yes," I said, the simple truth of her words resonating deep in my soul. "It really does." I had lost my name, my career, and my fortune. But here, in the dirt and the sawdust of a forgotten neighborhood in Portland, covered in sweat and paint, I was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to find myself. I was learning that a foundation wasn't made of concrete. A real foundation was made of purpose, of community, and of the quiet, honest work of making something good in a broken world. The 4 tiny homes for veterans became more than just a project. They became a proof of concept. When they were completed, they were not the soulless, utilitarian boxes one might expect from low-cost housing. They were beautiful. The clever placement of windows made the small interiors feel bright and airy. The use of reclaimed wood gave them a warmth and character that belied their humble origins. They were small, but they were filled with dignity. The local news did a small human interest story on the project. That story was picked up by a regional architecture blog, which focused on the innovative, low-cost, and sustainable design. From there, something unexpected began to happen. My quiet, anonymous life started to get a little louder. I began getting emails from other nonprofits, from community development organizations across the Pacific Northwest. They had seen the article and were asking for my help, for my designs. Maria, with her characteristic pragmatism, saw an opportunity. "You need to start your own practice, Amelia," she told me one afternoon as we sat in the small, chaotic office of Foundations for Hope. A different kind of practice. The idea was terrifying. To put my name, my tarnished, disgraced name, back out into the world felt like willingly stepping back into the line of fire. But with the encouragement of Maria and Elias, I did it. I didn't rent a fancy office. My firm was a secondhand desk in the corner of my basement apartment. I called it Keystone Design Collaborative. The name felt right. A keystone is the central, supporting stone of an arch. It's not the biggest or the flashiest stone, but without it, the whole structure falls apart. My new focus would be on that essential, foundational work, creating safe, dignified, and beautiful housing for people who needed it most. My work was the antithesis of everything I had done at Vance & Associates. My clients were not corporations. They were communities. My goal was not to win awards. It was to solve problems. I spent my days collaborating with social workers, community leaders, and the future residents of the buildings I was designing. I learned to listen, to design with empathy, to prioritize human need over architectural ego. My reputation began to grow in a small, niche corner of the architectural world, the world of humanitarian and public interest design. I was the architect who could do more with less, who could find beauty in a budget, who understood that good design was not a luxury, but a fundamental human right. About 5 years after the collapse, I was in Seattle, overseeing the construction of a multi-unit housing project for formerly homeless families, when I received an unexpected email. It was from the organizers of the Pritzker Prize, the most prestigious award in architecture, the Nobel Prize of my former profession. I assumed it was a fundraising request, but as I read it, my hands began to shake. The email explained that the prize committee had created a new, special award, the Pritzker Prize for Humanitarian Architecture. It was designed to honor an architect whose work was focused on social impact and service to humanity. I had been nominated. My first reaction was disbelief, followed by a strange, hollow laugh. Me, the woman who had lost her license, who had been the face of one of the biggest architectural disasters in recent memory. It seemed like a cruel joke. I almost deleted the email, but something made me pause. I thought about the families I had housed, about the veterans who had found a safe place to land, about the communities I had helped to strengthen. The work was real. The impact was real. Maybe, just maybe, it was worthy. The nomination process was rigorous, involving a detailed portfolio submission and interviews with the prize committee. I was sure I would be disqualified as soon as they did a thorough background check on my name. But a few months later, I was notified that I was one of the 3 finalists. The other 2 were world-renowned architects from Japan and Sweden, famous for their beautiful, large-scale humanitarian projects in developing countries. I was the clear underdog, the unknown, disgraced American. The news of my nomination sent a small shockwave through the architectural world. It was the first time my name had been mentioned in the mainstream architectural press in years. I received a single, terse email from my father. "Congratulations on the nomination," it read. "It seems your mother's talent has finally found a suitable, if modest, outlet." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of his role in my downfall. It was a classic Marcus Vance maneuver, a backhanded compliment designed to reframe my success as a mere extension of his and my mother's legacy. I deleted the email without replying. I flew to Paris for the awards ceremony, feeling like an imposter. The event was held in a grand, historic hall, the same venue where my father had been a finalist for the main Pritzker Prize a decade earlier. He had lost, a fact that had privately tormented him for years. The room was filled with the global superstars of architecture, people whose work I had studied, whose names I revered. I was wearing a simple, off-the-rack black dress, surrounded by a sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. When the head of the prize committee, a distinguished-looking woman with an elegant French accent, began to describe the winner's work, I clapped politely, assuming she was speaking of one of the other finalists. She spoke of an architecture of empathy, of finding profound beauty in the most humble of materials, of a deep and abiding commitment to the principle that a home is the foundation of a life. "This architect's journey has been an unconventional one," she continued, and my heart began to pound. "It is a story of a profound fall, and an even more profound rebirth. It is a testament to the idea that our greatest work often emerges not from our successes, but from our deepest wounds." And then, she said my name. Amelia Vance. I don't remember walking to the stage. It was a blur of bright lights, and the sound of thunderous applause. I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel like a ghost. I felt seen. I had prepared a short, professional speech, thanking the committee and my team. But as I looked out at that room, at the pinnacle of the world I had once so desperately wanted to conquer, I knew I had to say something else. I had to speak my truth. "Thank you," I began, my voice clear and steady. "There are 2 kinds of foundations in architecture. The first is made of concrete and steel. It is designed to bear the weight of a structure. The second is a foundation of integrity. It is designed to bear the weight of a life. For many years, I was an expert in the first, and a failure at the second. I told them my story. Not all of it, but the essential parts. I spoke of a brilliant mother, whose legacy of light I had tried to honor. I spoke of a father, whose legacy of ambition I had tried to serve. And I spoke of the terrible, tragic failure of a building that had forced me to learn the difference. "I lost my license, my career, and my name," I said, my voice quiet now, the vast hall silent. And in the rubble of that loss, I was given the chance to learn how to build again, from the ground up. I learned that the true purpose of architecture is not to create monuments to our own egos, but to create safe, dignified, beautiful spaces for people to live and to dream. My work is not glamorous. It will not define a skyline. But I have learned that building a single, safe room for a homeless veteran is a far greater achievement than designing a 50-story skyscraper. I concluded by dedicating the award to two groups of people. First, to the victims of the Northwood Library collapse. Their loss, I said, my voice thick with emotion, is a tragedy that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It is a stark and constant reminder of the profound, real-world responsibility that we as architects hold in our hands. And finally, I finished, I dedicate this to my mother, Eleanor Vance, not for the legacy of a firm that bears her name, but for the legacy of her belief that architecture, at its best, is an act of love. The applause that followed was different from the kind I had heard at the Solstice Tower Gala. It was not the polite applause for a powerful man. It was something deeper, something more human. As I walked off the stage, I saw Elias in the front row, his old face streaked with tears. The award changed everything, and it changed nothing at all. It gave my small nonprofit a global platform, and brought in a wave of donations and partnerships that allowed us to expand our work exponentially. It gave me a voice, a platform, to advocate for a more humane, more socially responsible approach to architecture. But it didn't change the core of my life. I returned not to a penthouse in Denver, but to my small, cluttered apartment in Portland. I returned to my work, to the daily challenges of tight budgets and complex human needs. The award, the prize money, the prestige, it was all just a tool, a new, more powerful hammer I could use to build the things that truly mattered. A week after the ceremony, I received a package. It was from my father. There was no letter, just a single, heavy object wrapped in velvet cloth. It was the Pritzker Prize medallion he had been awarded posthumously for my mother's early work. The one he had kept displayed in his office for decades, like a holy relic. It was a white flag, a concession, a silent acknowledgement of the truth he could never bring himself to speak. I put it away in a drawer. It was part of his story, not mine. My own journey had led me to a different understanding of legacy. It was not something you inherit, or have bestowed upon you. It wasn't a name on a building, or an award on a shelf. A real legacy is the quiet, cumulative impact of a life lived with purpose. It is in the foundations you lay, both literal and metaphorical. It is in the homes you build for others, and in the quiet, solid home you finally, painstakingly build within yourself. My hands will always bear the scars of the kitchen fire that ended one life, just as my heart will always bear the scars of the betrayal that ended another. But they are no longer just marks of pain. They are a reminder of the fire I walked through to get here. They are the hands that now sketch blueprints for shelters, for community centers, for safe havens. They are the hands that learned the weight of a hammer, and in doing so, learned the true measure of their own strength. They are the hands of a woman who finally, after a lifetime in the shadows, learned how to build in the light.